Picture this. You're a human being 70,000 years ago. No Google Maps, no weather app, no little blue dot telling you where you are. Just you, a sharpened rock, and an existential crisis that hasn't been invented yet because philosophy is still a few tens of thousands of years away. So, what does the Earth actually look like to you? Honestly, it looks like wherever you're currently standing, plus about a day's walk in every direction, and after that, here be dragons. Except the concept of dragons also hasn't been invented yet, so really it's just here be, I don't know, probably death. Let's start at the very beginning because that's apparently a very good place to start. For the overwhelming majority of human history, the planet you live on is not a planet. It's not even really a place, it's just everything. There's no outside view, there's no photo from space, there's no curvature to point at. Your entire understanding of the world is whatever you can see from the tallest hill nearby, and that's it. That's the whole show. And here's the thing that's actually kind of wild to sit with. For early humans, the horizon wasn't a scientific concept, it was the edge. Like the actual edge, because why wouldn't it be? You look out at the ocean or the plains or the desert, and the land just stops and meets the sky in a perfectly straight line, and nothing about that experience screams, oh yeah, this is just an optical effect caused by standing on a giant sphere. It screams, the world ends there, please do not go check. So the very first mental map any human ever drew, probably scratched into dirt with a stick or gestured at with a very confident hand, was basically a circle. You, in the middle. Your camp, your river, your family, your dangerous neighboring tribe who definitely started it. And then a ring around all of that. And beyond the ring, nothing. Or worse than nothing, monsters, spirits. Your uncle who wandered off one day and never came back and is now a cautionary tale told around the fire. This is a pattern that shows up in nearly every early human culture, completely independently on completely different continents with zero communication between them. Mesopotamians, Egyptians, early Chinese civilizations, indigenous groups across the Americas, over and over again, humans look at the world and land on roughly the same idea. Flat ground, a dome or vault of sky sitting on top of it like a lid on a pot, and the ocean or some cosmic river wrapped around the outside edge like a moat around a castle. It's less that ancient people were unusually gullible, and more that this is simply what the world looks like if your only tools for measuring it are your eyes and your legs. It was, frankly, an extremely reasonable conclusion to draw. If anything, believing in a flat disk world was the rational, evidence-based position for about 95% of human history. Sorry to the folks who like to feel superior about this one. Let's actually go somewhere concrete for a second because I want you to see one of these maps. The Babylonians around the 6th century BCE made what's often called the oldest known world map, a little clay tablet now sitting in the British Museum, and it is spectacular in its confidence. It shows Babylon obviously dead center because when you're the one drawing the map, you get main character privileges. Around it, a ring representing a salt sea. And beyond that ring, out past the edge of the known world, a series of triangular regions labeled as remote islands or regions, and one of them is described in a way that basically translates to a place so far away the sun doesn't shine there, which, phenomenal writing, ancient Babylonian scribe, no notes. That's the whole world. That's it. Everything humanity has ever known, its entire accumulated geography, fits on an object smaller than your hand. Now compare that to Egypt, roughly the same era, give or take. The Egyptians had a wonderfully specific cosmology where the sky was literally a goddess, Nut, arched over the earth on her hands and feet like she's doing an extremely long-duration yoga pose, while the earth itself was a god, Geb, lying beneath her, and in between them, holding the sky up so it doesn't collapse onto the earth, is the air god Shu, essentially working the world's most thankless permanent shift. Every single day, forever, arms up, holding the sky. No breaks, no union. Just infinite sky holding. You have to admire the mental image, though. The sun, personified as Ra, sails across the sky in a boat every single day, and then at night, sails through the underworld in that same boat to come back around for sunrise. Ancient Egypt basically invented the daily commute, except the commute is through the literal land of the dead, and the vehicle is a boat in the sky that becomes an underground boat at night. If your Monday commute feels bad, remember that at least it doesn't require passing through the realm of Osiris. Now let's hop over to the Norse world for a second, because their version might be my personal favorite. In Norse cosmology, the world is Midgard, a circular realm connected to the wider cosmos by Yggdrasil. An enormous world tree whose branches and roots stretch out to hold together 9 separate realms. Homes for gods, giants, elves, and the dead. Surrounding Midgard is a vast ocean, and coiled around the entire thing, biting its own tail, is a sea serpent called Jormungandr, big enough to circle the whole known world, which is a genuinely metal way to explain we don't know what's past the ocean, but also gives you a sense of just how consistently, across totally unrelated cultures, people reached for the same basic shape: a home in the middle, a boundary of water, and something enormous and vaguely threatening patrolling the edge of the map. Meanwhile, over in Indigenous cosmologies across the Americas, the details vary enormously by nation and region, but a lot of traditions describe a version of Turtle Island. The idea that the land itself rests on the back of a great turtle, floating in a primordial sea. It's a strikingly elegant image, honestly, solid ground held up by something living, drifting through water that has no known edge. If you're looking for a common thread running through basically all of these ancient cosmologies, worldwide, independently invented, it's this. Land floating or resting on something, surrounded by water, capped by sky. Different casts of characters, same basic set design. Now here's a fun wrinkle in all this. It's a common myth that ancient people universally thought the Earth was flat right up until Columbus proved otherwise by not falling off the edge of the ocean. That is, respectfully, nonsense. And it's one of those historical myths that just refuses to die because it makes for a tidier story. In reality, the idea that the Earth is a sphere goes back a lot further than people assume. And once you know the timeline, it gets genuinely funny how early this was figured out. Around the 6th century BCE, Greek philosophers start floating the idea. Pythagoras, yes, that Pythagoras, the triangle guy, is credited by later writers with proposing a spherical Earth, likely for aesthetic and philosophical reasons more than observational ones. The sphere was considered the perfect shape, so if the universe was orderly and rational, of course the Earth would be a sphere. Which, sure, that's not exactly rigorous science, that's basically spheres are cool and tidy, so the planet must be one, but they happen to land on the correct answer through vibes alone, so we'll allow it. Then Aristotle comes along in the 4th century BCE and actually brings receipts. He points out that during a lunar eclipse, when the Earth's shadow passes across the moon, that shadow is always curved. Not sometimes curved and sometimes weird and jagged. Always a clean circular arc. And the only shape that reliably casts a circular shadow no matter how it's oriented is a sphere. He also points out that as you travel north or south, different stars become visible or disappear below the horizon, and new constellations rise into view, which makes total sense if you're walking along the curved surface of a giant ball, and makes zero sense if you're walking across a flat pancake. So by roughly 350 BCE, educated people in the Mediterranean world already know, with actual evidence, that the Earth is round. This is a genuinely underrated fact. There is more time between Aristotle figuring out the Earth is a sphere and Columbus sailing to the Americas than there is between Columbus and us, right now, today. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let that sit for a second. Aristotle is closer in time to a functioning theory of orbital mechanics than he is to Columbus. History is not a straight line. It's a mess, and it's a lot weirder than the everyone was dumb until suddenly they weren't story we got taught in school. But knowing the Earth is round is one thing. Knowing how big it is, that's a whole different flex, and somebody actually pulled it off with nothing but a stick, a well, and an absurd amount of confidence. Enter Eratosthenes, librarian at Alexandria, around 240 BCE. Eratosthenes hears that in the city of Cyane, on the summer solstice, The sun shines straight down a deep well at noon, casting no shadow at all, meaning the sun is directly overhead. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, a city roughly north of Siene, he measures the shadow cast by a vertical stick at that exact same moment and finds the sun is not directly overhead there. It's off by a small angle. If the Earth were flat, the sun's angle would be identical everywhere at the same moment. It isn't, which means the surface must be curving away between the two cities. So Eratosthenes does some math, genuinely elegant, simple geometry, using the angle of that shadow and the known distance between the two cities, and calculates the circumference of the entire planet. His answer comes out somewhere in the ballpark of the actual modern value, off by maybe a few percent, depending on exactly which ancient unit of measurement historians think he was using, because ancient units are their own special nightmare to convert. But the point stands, over 2,000 years ago, a guy with a well, a stick, and some camel-measured distances figured out the size of the entire Earth, sitting in a library without ever leaving Egypt. A few centuries later, another Alexandrian scholar, Claudius Ptolemy, takes things a huge step further. Around 150 CE, he compiles a work called the Geography, which attempts to lay out coordinates, latitude and longitude, for thousands of locations across the known world, along with instructions on how to project a curved planet onto a flat page without hopelessly distorting it. This is a legitimately enormous intellectual achievement, and it becomes the gold standard reference for cartography for well over 1,000 years. It also happens to contain some fairly significant errors, including an underestimate of the Earth's circumference, an error that, centuries later, quietly convinces a certain Genoese sailor that Asia is a lot closer to Europe, by sailing west, than it actually is. So in a roundabout, unintentional way, Ptolemy's math mistake is part of the reason Columbus ever left port in the first place. Being wrong, it turns out, can still accidentally change history. Meanwhile, over in ancient China, a completely separate tradition, completely separate cosmology, has got its own model going. The idea that heaven is round and Earth is square. A concept sometimes called Gai Tian, which shaped everything from their architecture to the design of ancient coins, which were round with a square hole punched through the middle, a physical little model of the entire cosmos you could carry around in your pocket. Later Chinese astronomers developed more sophisticated spherical models too, complete with instruments to track celestial motion with startling precision, entirely independent of what's happening in Greece. Humans, it turns out, keep rediscovering variations on the same basic questions over and over in isolation, because looking up at the sky and going, okay, but what actually is this, turns out to be one of the universal human impulses. Let's also take a quick detour through the Islamic Golden Age, because this era doesn't get nearly enough credit in the popular version of this story, and it absolutely deserves a spot here. Between roughly the 8th and 14th centuries, scholars working across the Islamic world, from Baghdad's House of Wisdom to Cordoba in Spain, preserved, translated, and dramatically expanded on Greek geographical knowledge, while also generating an enormous amount of original work of their own. Astronomers like al-Battani refined measurements of the Earth's tilt and the length of the year with striking precision. Geographers like al-Idrisi, working in the 12th century for the Norman king of Sicily, produced one of the most detailed and accurate world maps of the entire medieval period. A silver planisphere accompanied by a massive descriptive text covering climate, trade routes, and regional detail across 3 continents. Muslim scholars also refined the astrolabe, an instrument used to measure the position of celestial bodies, which became an essential tool for navigation, timekeeping, and determining the direction of prayer across vast distances. None of this was happening in a vacuum sealed off from the rest of the world either. Trade routes connected Baghdad to India, to China, to sub-Saharan Africa, meaning geographical knowledge was constantly being exchanged, updated, and corrected across cultures long before anyone in Western Europe started calling this period an age of exploration, as if exploring were something that had never occurred to anyone before. All right, let's fast forward a bit, because after Rome falls in the West and we hit the medieval period, you'd think, based on pop culture, that Europe collectively forgets the Earth is round and reverts to flat Earth panic. That's another myth. It's a really persistent one, mostly manufactured much later in the 1800s by writers trying to make a point about religion versus science and being a little loose with the historical facts to do it. In reality, educated medieval Europeans, including church scholars, generally accepted a spherical Earth the entire time. It shows up in university curricula, it shows up in art. There's a whole genre of medieval maps called mappae mundi, literally cloths of the world, and one of the most famous, the Hereford Mappa Mundi from around 1300, is this gorgeous, chaotic, almost overwhelming piece of parchment that tries to cram in geography, mythology, biblical history, and monster taxonomy all onto one map. And when I say monster taxonomy, I mean it. Along the edges of the known world on maps like these, map makers would routinely just put monsters, sea serpents, griffins, people with faces in their chests, because apparently that was a real thing someone believed lived in remote Africa. Giant ants that mine gold, a one-legged creature called a cyapod that uses its enormous single foot as a parasol. This wasn't necessarily meant literally in every case. Some of it was symbolic, some of it was inherited from older Greek and Roman travel writers who'd clearly been at the wine, but the practical effect is the same. The edges of the map, the places nobody had actually verified, got filled in with pure, glorious imagination. This is genuinely where the phrase "here be dragons" comes from, sort of. There's actually only one surviving map that uses that exact Latin phrase on a globe from the early 1500s. But the spirit of drawing something terrifying wherever knowledge runs out runs through basically the entire history of cartography. And honestly, relatable. If you don't know what's past a certain point, you fill the gap with your worst fear. Ancient and medieval people did it with sea monsters. We do it by doom scrolling. Same instinct, different century. Alongside the mappae mundi, a much more practical, much less monster-heavy style of map was also developing among medieval sailors, particularly around the Mediterranean. The portolan chart. These were startlingly accurate coastal maps covered in a web of crisscrossing lines called rhumb lines, used to plot compass bearings between ports. Unlike the symbolic theological mappae mundi, portolan charts were working documents, drawn from real accumulated experience, tested and corrected voyage after voyage, and they get coastlines, especially around the Mediterranean and Black Sea, looking remarkably close to modern satellite outlines. It's a great reminder that even in periods we tend to write off as geographically clueless, there was often a parallel, much more grounded tradition running quietly alongside the fantastical stuff built by people who simply needed to not crash their boat. Now, one thing that's worth sitting with is just how small the known world actually was for most of human history, even for the most well-traveled, well-educated people alive. A well-read Roman citizen in the 2nd century might have a decent mental map of the Mediterranean, parts of Europe, North Africa, and a hazy, rumor-based idea of India and beyond, courtesy of some very brave merchants along overland trade routes. But the Americas? Total blank. Not unexplored on the map, not even a concept. Australia? Doesn't exist as far as anyone in Rome or Alexandria or Baghdad is concerned. Most of sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific. Rumors at best filtered through several layers of secondhand storytelling by the time they reach a mapmaker's desk. Meanwhile, obviously entire thriving, sophisticated civilizations were living in all those blank spaces the whole time with their own detailed, functional, and often startlingly accurate understanding of their own regional geography. Polynesian navigators, for example, were crossing thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean using wave patterns, star positions, and bird behavior with a level of precision that genuinely stuns modern researchers, doing all of this centuries before European sailors worked up the nerve to lose sight of the coastline. They developed stick charts, intricate lattice constructions made from palm ribs and shells, mapping swell patterns and island locations, an entirely different but no less valid technology for understanding the shape of the world. Indigenous peoples across the Americas maintained trade networks spanning entire continents, moving goods, ideas, and geographic knowledge across thousands of miles long before European contact. None of this required a map in the parchment and ink sense at all. It required an intimate, generational, deeply lived-in relationship with the land and sky, which honestly might be a more impressive way to know the world than owning a fancy globe. So really, there wasn't one ancient view of Earth. There were dozens running in parallel, all across the planet, each one shaped by local geography, local mythology, and local necessity. The through line, the thing every single one of them shares, is that the known world was always small, always centered on you and your people, and always faded out into uncertainty, myth, or straight up monsters at the edges. That's not a flaw of ancient thinking. That's simply what it feels like to be a creature with two working eyes and a maximum sightline of maybe 30 miles on a good, clear day from a hilltop. Which brings us to the actual turning point, the moment the edges of everyone's maps started getting forcibly, sometimes violently, connected to each other. The age of exploration, roughly the 15th through 17th centuries, is where these separate, isolated pictures of the world start crashing into one another. And when I say crashing, I do mean that somewhat literally, because a huge amount of this process involved European powers showing up in places that were very much already known, already mapped, already inhabited by people with their own long, rich histories, and declaring them discovered. It's one of history's great ironies that Columbus dies still convinced he'd found a new route to Asia, never fully accepting that he'd run into two entire continents nobody in Europe had any concept of. Continents that were, again, extremely occupied at the time. And this is the part that finally, genuinely, does start to shift the average person's mental image of Earth more than any Greek geometry proof ever could, because now you've got actual ships coming back with actual reports, actual goods, actual maps that keep getting less wrong every single decade. Magellan's expedition in the early 1500s actually sails all the way around the planet. Well, Magellan himself dies partway through in the Philippines, but his crew finishes the job. And that's the first time humanity has direct, physical, undeniable proof of the Earth's roundness that doesn't require trusting a shadow-based geometry argument from a guy in a library 2,000 years earlier. You can just point at the ship and go, it left, and it came back from the other direction. Case closed. From here, maps start filling in fast, and they start getting weirdly obsessive about precision, in that specific way European institutions of the era loved. You get the rise of proper cartographic science. The Mercator projection in 1569, which is the map projection basically everyone's brain still defaults to today when they picture the world map, despite the fact that it wildly distorts the size of land masses near the poles, meaning Greenland looks roughly the size of Africa on it when in reality Africa is about 14 times larger. It was designed for navigation, not accuracy of scale, and yet it became the default mental image of Earth for centuries, which is a pretty good reminder that the tools we use to represent the world quietly shape how we understand the world, whether we notice it or not. By the time you get to the 18th and 19th centuries, exploration, trade, colonization, and increasingly rigorous science have basically filled in every blank space on the map, at least from a European cartographic standpoint. The poles get reached, the interiors of continents get charted, and the mythical sea monsters get quietly retired from the map margins and demoted to folklore. Captain Cook's voyages across the Pacific in the late 1700s finally correct centuries of European guesswork and rumor about the geography of Australia, New Zealand, and the wider Pacific, though, of course, all of it was already thoroughly known to the people already living there. The edge of the world stops being a physical place you might sail off of and becomes something more abstract, the edge of knowledge rather than the edge of geography. And then, obviously, the final, most dramatic shift of all, photographs from space. The Apollo missions in the late 1960s and early 1970s produce images like Earthrise and the Blue Marble, and for the first time in the entire multi-100,000-year history of our species, every single human being can look at an actual photograph of the whole planet at once. Not a guess, not a projection, not a clay tablet with Babylon suspiciously placed in the exact center. An actual photo. A small blue cloud-swirled ball hanging in an ocean of black, with no visible borders, no labeled countries, none of the divisions we've spent our entire history fighting wars over. It's worth pausing on how genuinely disorienting that must have been for the astronauts who saw it firsthand, floating there in real time rather than in a photograph. Several of them came back describing something researchers now actually have a name for: the overview effect, a shift in perspective that hits you when you see the entire Earth as one small, fragile, unified object, with the atmosphere as nothing more than a razor-thin blue line wrapped around it, way thinner and more delicate looking than anyone expects. Borders vanish. Countries vanish. From that vantage point, all that's left is the planet. One planet, no visible seams, holding every single human who has ever lived, argued about map edges, drawn sea monsters out of fear of the unknown, or held up the sky on their own back for eternity like poor shoe. Astronauts describe this shift in strikingly consistent terms. No matter their nationality, their politics, or their religious background, a sudden, almost overwhelming sense that all the boundaries we spend our lives defending and dying over are, from 100 miles up, completely invisible. Some come back and describe it as spiritual. Others describe it in more scientific, ecological terms, a newfound protectiveness toward this one thin, fragile shell of atmosphere that happens to be keeping literally everyone alive. Either way, it's a genuinely strange kind of closure to the whole story we've been walking through. The same species that once assumed the world ended a day's walk from home eventually built a machine that let a handful of its members leave the planet entirely and look back at the whole thing at once. So if you zoom all the way back out on this whole journey, from a human standing on a hilltop assuming the visible horizon is literally the edge of existence, all the way to a photograph of a small blue marble floating in the dark, what you're really watching is the story of our species slowly, painfully, expanding its own sense of here. For most of human history, here meant your valley, your coastline, your village, and everything past that was either unknown, dangerous, or populated by imaginary creatures drawn by a nervous map maker filling in blank parchment. Bit by bit, through geometry, through eclipses, through terrifyingly long boat trips, through stubborn librarians measuring shadows with sticks, through astrolabes and stick charts and silver planispheres, here kept getting bigger, until eventually here meant the whole planet, viewed all at once from outside itself. And somehow, even with satellite imagery, GPS, and the ability to zoom into your own street from a phone in your pocket, we still haven't fully absorbed that shift. Most people still walk around with a mental map that's basically their commute, their neighborhood, their usual haunts, plus a hazy rumor-shaped understanding of everywhere else, which, if you think about it, isn't actually all that different from a Babylonian scribe placing his own city dead center on a clay tablet and drawing everything else as vague triangular blobs labeled somewhere out there. We've just swapped the clay tablet for a phone screen. The instinct to put ourselves at the center of the map never really left. It just got a much better resolution and considerably fewer sea monsters drawn along the edges, although, honestly, some days it's hard to be entirely sure about that last part either.